This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, a website, or an online store, make your next move with Squarespace. 72. That's how many individual pieces this table is comprised of. So that's how many pieces I had to cut out and glue back together in order to put this thing together. And don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining. I realize I could have easily avoided that obstacle in favor of others had I decided to use hardwood or even laminated veneer lumber. So that brings up the question, well, then why use plywood? To which I say, why ask ply? Wood. Okay, so really, why use plywood? Well, a couple reasons, I guess. First, and shallowest, is I just thought it would look cool and be fun. I love plywood. It's a great material to work with. And second, as I was working on designs for this table and thinking about joinery, I kept thinking about ways to build the joinery up in an additive way as opposed to the more normal approach where it's created by removing material. So to start this project, I ripped every piece that I was going to need to the final width. It's made up of mostly 2-inch wide pieces and a few 3-inch wide pieces. So that's what you've been seeing me do so far. Then I started cross-cutting the feet pieces to their normal length, or close to it, so that I could start putting them together. In total, I had to glue up 10 block foot things like you see here. Once they were glued up, I set them aside to dry so that I could start working on other portions of the table. The next thing that I wanted to get together were the 2 long stretcher pieces, which are kind of like the backbone of this entire table. I don't mean that in terms of physical strength, but more in that they're sort of like the reference point for everything else. The biggest challenge with this table was honestly the order of operations, and, well, these 2 pieces are sort of where everything starts. In fact, let's go to the drawing so you can see my thinking. So as I mentioned, everything started with these long stretcher pieces. So here's the top stretcher. To that I added my 2 center tabletop supporters. These are all technical names, by the way. Anyway, I put one on either side. Next, I laminated on 4 more siding pieces to the top stretcher. I could use those as references for the 2 vertical legs. I'll show you how I constructed those in just a minute. Next, I added the other long stretcher on the bottom. Then laminated on 2 stretcher siding pieces. And to those I could attach my 8 feet, 4 of which support the tabletop and 4 of which touch the ground. Then I laminated on 4 more siding pieces, 1 on each side of the 2 vertical pieces to thicken and stiffen them up. And then the final siding laminated pieces on the end of the top and bottom stretchers. And of course the tabletop would sit, well, on top. So that's how it all works in theory, but we're not out of the plywoods yet. We still have to see how well we can translate all of that theory into reality. That said, let's get to work. Back in the real world, the next thing I wanted to do was put together the sub-assemblies for the 2 vertical pieces. So I started by cross-cutting 4 pieces for each sub-assembly at 2 different lengths. This is a good example of how I talked about creating joinery in an additive way rather than through removal of material. You can see while I'm gluing them up, I'm using an offcut that's the same width as the long stretcher pieces so that I guess these would be bridle joints, maybe? Anyhow, whatever these joints are will be just the right size to accommodate the stretcher. By the way, don't worry about the nails. I used a lot of nails and screws on this project, but only in pieces that'll end up being laminated over, so you're not going to see any of them in the finished product. While those glued up, I got back to the foot block things that we made a couple minutes ago and started shaping all of those. This was probably the most potentially dangerous portion of the build for a couple reasons. One, the blade is high and angled, as is the piece being cut. But more perilous is the fact that I'm making the same sort of cut 4 times on each of 8 individual pieces. I really believe that it's in these repetitive processes that focus can be lost and danger really creeps in. Luckily though, my mind was fully on the workpiece and not on something else like, I don't know, my website. And that's thanks to Squarespace. Squarespace has made it really simple for me to create and maintain my site with a really low amount of effort on my part. Now, that wouldn't really mean that much if my site happened to look like a 1998 tribute to the Dave Matthews Band built on GeoCities, but it doesn't. In fact, I happen to think it looks pretty great. And that's because Squarespace's awesome, award-winning templates allow me to display my work in a clean and easy-to-navigate site so that I can put my best foot forward. Seriously, if you need a website, or even if you have an existing one, check out Squarespace. They have solutions that are perfect for musicians, designers, restaurants, or pretty much any other type of site that you might need. Visit squarespace.com/4eyes and use the offer code 4eyes to save 10% off your first order. There's a link in the description below. Seriously, check them out. Alright, so with all the feet cut, I went back to my long stretchers, which were dry by now, and cut them to their final length and put a 15-degree angle on the ends. By the way, I guess I should mention anytime you see me cutting an angle in this video, I'm cutting it to 15 degrees. Bevel, miter, doesn't matter. Once that was done, I could start actually attaching some of my sub-assemblies, like we went over in the drawing a couple minutes ago. So first up were the center table rest things on the top stretcher. I actually screwed one of them in. I don't know why, since I couldn't do both. But for the most part, all of these are pretty loosely attached initially. But they'll get locked into place as we continue putting things together. Trust me. After that, I marked things up so that I could cut out and laminate more pieces onto the stretcher. These little offcuts with 15-degree angles were perfect for helping me to lay out my cut lines just right. It's often the case that the best jigs are actually offcuts. Sometimes they only serve the purpose of allowing you to make one more cut, and if that's the case, that's fine. They've done their job, and then some. Once those were dry, I attached the leg sub-assembly to the top stretcher assembly. These are always some of the most enjoyable parts of a build for me, because it's sort of the antithesis of what we normally think of in terms of woodworking and progress. Most of the hours you spend in the shop, you're making refinements and shaping all these little details that you don't get to fully appreciate until much later. But here, in these moments, you slap on some glue and drive a couple screws, and all of a sudden the piece is transformed from a bunch of random scraps of wood to the beginnings of a dining table. It's like putting together IKEA furniture, only less frustrating because you understand the instructions and they're in your head, instead of still in the box. Next, I could attach the bottom stretcher to the legs. This was pretty much the same process as attaching the top stretcher, but a little easier because I didn't have to hold the legs at the same time that I was trying to screw them together. Here I'm laying out some cut lines for the pieces that I'll laminate to the bottom stretcher. I should have mentioned this before, but with most of what you see me doing in the shots like this, I'm making 2 of each of these pieces, 1 for each side, even though I'm only showing 1. Next, I could finish off the stretcher by laminating all of the end cap pieces on. I had to do 8 of these in total. I started by cutting an angle off one side, holding it up to the stretcher and marking how long it needed to be, then cutting it and gluing it on. The only other thing I had to do to finish off the base was laminate 2 more pieces to each vertical. In this shot, you can see that the leg is comprised of 4 pieces at the moment. When it's finished, it'll be 6 pieces. But for some reason, I forgot to film myself cutting them and putting them on. Alright, let's get to work on the tabletop. This is the biggest, heaviest part of the whole table, but thankfully, it was also the easiest. Using plywood really takes a lot of the challenges that are associated with making a large panel off of the, well, for lack of a better word, table. Most large glue-up situations tend to make me pretty anxious, but I gotta say, this one was downright relaxing. Let me cut the music for a second so you can experience it the way that I did. Nothing like getting up early on a Sunday morning, throwing on your favorite Hacksaw Jim Duggan t-shirt, and heading out to the garage to spread some glue as a chorus of birds cheers you on. Anyway, for as relaxing as the glue up may have been, trying to muscle this thing back on top of the workbench brought me back to reality. This thing was heavy, way heavier than I expected. Luckily, I found a neighbor passing by to lend a hand. Once it was up on the bench, I cut a 15-degree bevel on each of the edges. It's pretty subtle, but I wanted it to match the angle used on the rest of the piece. And it's still definitely noticeable, at least in person, more than on camera anyway. Alright, so once the table's finished, it's going to go to my parents' house, and since they have grandkids, it was really important that the table didn't have any sharp corners or edges. That said, I didn't want to use any radiuses or roundover bits. I guess at the end of the day, my goal was to end up with a piece that still looked dangerous to touch, but was rounded over just enough to not split your head open if you knocked into it. Back to the base. Aesthetically, everything was finished and looking good. But my plan was to go back and reinforce each of the feet with a little metal insurance policy, especially after feeling how heavy the top was. So I went out and bought a metal cutoff wheel that I could put onto my miter saw, and some 1/4-inch thick flat bar that I could cut into about 1 foot lengths. Manly. Then I marked out some spots on the feet where I could make a little recess to attach said metal flat bar, and then I went ahead and mortised out some material. So while I'm routing, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank all of my Patreon members. I was amazed at how many new signups I had this month, and I want to read off all of your names. So to get through that, I'm going to go ahead and channel the Micro Machines guy in 3, 2. Special thanks goes out to Daniel Van Doom, Chris Bird, Jared Randall, Make It, Marios Pronieris, Zohab Hansen, Jake Tweedo, Richard Sandow, Thomas Guerrero, Daniel Fernandez, Alex Barrera, Kendon Blackhouse, Carl Pountney, Tors van Emsely, Kaj Luderfeld, Alex Dolwick, Ramiro Garate, Greg Reuski, Ayal Zendani, Make Jake Make, Christian Buzio, Cameron Easley, Daryl Long, Ronnie Brevik Gronhag, Joshua Lynn Weaver, and Mads Hammer. Woo! Nailed it. Anyhow, big thank you to all of my Patreon members and for your continued support and for enabling me to do what I do. And good news, I started shipping out the t-shirts and field notes booklets, so be on the lookout for those in the coming weeks. And if you want to find out more about how you can support the show too, there's a link to my Patreon page in the description. So take a look, see if it's for you, and as always, no pressure. If this is your first time to my channel, welcome. And if you like what you're seeing so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks. Also, don't forget to follow me on Instagram. That's probably the best place to check out what I'm doing in real time. Alright, so after the mortises were mortised and I had drilled out some screw holes, the last thing to do was attach the metal bars, screw down the top, and this puppy was done. As I mentioned earlier, I built this table for my parents, the two people in this world who've given me more than anybody else. And while I was building it, I couldn't help but to think back to Christmas Eve 1994, when a young, glassesless Chris Salamone went to bed, warm and content with the knowledge that in a few short hours, he'd be waking up to a brand new, shiny, 14-foot in diameter trampoline. And how now, on the eve of this table being delivered, my parents must have shared some of those same feelings of excitement and anticipation, as images of solid hardwood and adjectives like family heirloom danced in their heads. So I can only imagine their confusion when instead of an heirloom quality piece, this slapped together pile of plywood came through their door. If I had to guess, I'd say it might feel a little like expecting a trampoline and waking up to moon shoes. Which, by the way, are probably more dangerous than a trampoline, but whatever. See you next time.